Hey guys, so what I decided to start doing is recording the lessons so that you guys can do them in class at your own pace. And feel free to ask questions. So at any point, if this version of me is moving way too fast, just pause it. Ask that version of me. So it's actually really weird that there's two of me in the same room. But if you're ever lost, feel free to stop and just come and ask me. But the reason I did this is it's a bit more work. It's actually a lot more work for me. However, it allows you guys to move through the lessons at your own pace. So feel free to stop. And this just goes, it matches the course packs that I made for you guys. So yesterday we talked about some modern challenges to liberalism. Some of the things that we talked about was the struggle between modern and classical liberalism, positive versus negative freedoms, neoconservatism, environmentalism, the Christian right. And we said that all these are challenges to liberalism. And so today we're going to focus on imposing liberalism, how it is that we do that, and what are the consequences of doing that. One of the things about liberalism is that when you start to impose it on someone, it basically ceases to be liberalism, as we talked about yesterday. No one became democratic at gunpoint. And so, because this section is so big, I decided to split it up into two sections. We're going to talk about how liberalism is imposed domestically. And anytime you guys hear the word domestic, that's talking about within our country, and how liberalism is imposed around the world. That'll be the second part. So the first part is domestically, and that is within Canada. How do we impose liberalism? And specifically, how do we impose it on Indigenous or Aboriginal people? And so the first question, what does imposition mean? And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to set up a little pointer and I'm just going to highlight the key information. And so what does imposition mean? Imposition means forcing something on people whether they want it or not. So anytime you force something on people whether they want it or not, you are imposing that on them. So we can impose liberalism, we can impose Christianity, we can impose our personal beliefs about government. So anytime we force something on people whether they want it or not, that's what imposition or imposing means. And so the first on that first page, you'll notice that there are two blanks, and so this I'm going to explain what goes into those two blanks. The stuff in black, highlighted black, is the stuff that goes into the two blanks. And so liberalism has been imposed on people at various points in history, sometimes with negative consequences. Some of the motivations are humanitarian. The word humanitarian just means to help them out for the sake of the fact that they are human, just out of the kindness of your heart. So when we talk about the war in Afghanistan, oftentimes people will say that that was humanitarian, right? Or another reason why we impose liberalism is for self-interest. And so an example of this is the war in Iraq and West Berlin. The reason why I put a question mark next to Iraq is because if you ask the U.S. government, they'll tell you that they didn't go into Iraq for self-interest. But if you ask other sources, they'll tell you that it was for self-interest, for oil, right? And so West Berlin, we also talked about why that's an imposition of liberalism, because West Berlin obviously was basically controlled by liberal countries, and they imposed their ideas on the people of West Berlin. And so the two big motivations when we talk about imposing liberalism, number one is humanitarian, number two is self-interest. And as I always said, feel free to pause, feel free to go back. I'll be here forever. Right? Okay, so liberalism and Aboriginal culture will be our first focus for today. And so before we get started on liberalism and Aboriginal culture, I found this amazing quotation by a scholar, author named Rodolfo Stavenhagen. And this is quotation. Ever since early colonial settlement, Canada's Indigenous people, Indigenous just means First Peoples, were progressively dispossessed of their land, resources, and culture, a process that led them into destitution, deprivation, and dependency, which in turn generated assertive and occasionally militant social movements in defense of their rights, restitution of their land and resources, and struggle for equal opportunity and self-determination. It said a lot of things. Let's just break it down into simple language. Feel free to just write this down on the sheet underneath that quotation. And so, what is Rodolfo basically saying? He's saying that throughout the history of Canada, Indigenous people have been marginalized and pushed to the edges. We've taken so much from them that it's resulted in a very toxic relationship, right? And obviously, as a result, it's basically broken the relationship, right? We basically pushed them to the side, and now many of them want self-determination, and it's created a very toxic relationship. What's really interesting is that Rodolfo Stavenhaven is actually a Mexican author. But he's talking about how it is that we've treated our indigenous people in Canada. And so right under there, we'll go into our first little bit. Canada is ranked very poorly by the UN in terms of its treatment of First Nations people. And so Canada has a very high ranking on the Human Development Scale. And so what does the first blank? The first blank is Canada has a high ranking on the Human Development Scale, or HDI. If you guys see HDI, that means the same thing, Human Development Scale. And really it measures three things: GDP per capita, or basically wealth per person, life expectancy, how long we live, and literacy. And so our high ranking, which is I think currently 2018 it was about 12, would dramatically drop. And so this is obviously an older presentation. It changes every year. Would dramatically drop from 9th to 48th out of 174 countries if judged on the experiences of the FNMI community. You'll notice that it says 9th to 48th. It's constantly changing. So when this presentation was made, it was a couple of years ago, and it's a bit off. And so if we were to judge, if our Human Development Index was only based on how we treat our indigenous people, we drop from 9th to 48th. Some of the countries that would be above us are Greece. If you guys know anything about Greece, Greece is a mess, an economic mess. And so that should tell you that our indigenous people are basically living at a standard far lower than the rest of the population, right? So poverty, infant mortality, unemployment, morbidity, suicide, criminal detention, children on welfare, women victims of abuse, child prostitution are all much higher among Aboriginal peoples than any other sector of Canadian society. This is by United Nations Human Rights Commission. So basically saying that our Indigenous people are basically living a different life than the rest of the population, right? More poverty, more infant death, more abuse, more drug use, more suicide. And so if we look at how we treat our Indigenous people, in a nutshell, guys, we've treated our Indigenous people as a country like crap. Right? And so liberalism and Aboriginal culture. So now we're on to page number 3. And so you guys will notice that on page number 3, there's a lot of blanks. And so what I did was I went ahead and I highlighted in red what goes into those blanks. And so I'm going to give you guys a chance to copy down the blanks, and then I'm going to explain the ideas that you just copied down, because it makes no use just writing down information without understanding these ideas. And so I'm going to give you a couple seconds. Feel free to pause. Right? I won't be offended. Feel free to pause, write down these ideas, and then just press play, and I'll explain them. So contact between First Nations people in Canada and European settlers presented conflicting worldviews and ideology. Most European settlers brought with them liberal values and beliefs, while many First Nations believed in collectivist ideas. So many of the Europeans that came over were very individualistic. And so if you guys remember, liberalism is very individualistic ideology. And many Indigenous people were very collectivist. And so you have these two ideas clashing. And so subsequently, values of liberalism would be imposed on Aboriginals in an attempt to assimilate them into mainstream Canadian society. I hope you guys know what the word assimilate means, but in case you don't, I gave you a little space to copy that down. Assimilate means when a majority group absorbs the minority group, resulting in the loss of a group's native language and culture. I use the word native in this case, not to talk about a certain people, but just their original language. Right? So basically when the minority is absorbed into the majority. This happens a lot to immigrants. There's not so much assimilation. Like for example, when I came to Canada, as some of you guys may know, I was not born in Canada, but as a result of being in Canada, I was basically absorbed into the majority group. I basically don't. I understand Swahili, the language that my parents speak, but I don't speak it very well. A lot of the customs that my parents have, I don't have myself. And so basically the whole goal of Europeans was to assimilate them and to make them like everyone else. Right? So assimilate is when we take the minority and we absorb them into the majority until they lose what makes them unique. And this was basically the goal of Europeans because of these conflicting worldviews. Okay, so you'll see a line, you just jump down. So historically, and as I said always, anytime you guys see the stuff in red or black that's bolded, that's the stuff that goes into the blanks. I'll also be pointing things out. So feel free once again to pause me, right? Copy it down and then play again, and I'll explain these concepts. Okay, so historically, indigenous populations were settled in Canada for thousands of years before the arrival of European settlers. That's why it's really weird. I'm going to show you guys a really interesting video, and I want you guys to think about what's wrong with this video. So I'm going to skip out. I'm going to show you guys the video. Then we're going to talk about what is wrong with this video. Okay. So HBC, you guys can just HBC Vancouver commercial. You guys can also feel free to do that. I'm going to show you guys, it's just the initial part.
We arrived 340 years ago to a land of rock, ice, and snow. We outfitted a nation of pioneers.
Awesome. So let's go back. So what I want you guys to pay attention to this ad is that they say that we arrived here on a land of ice, rock, and snow. So for many Europeans and for many history classes, history starts when Europeans show up. But in actuality, our indigenous people, our Aboriginal people have always been here, right? And this becomes an issue because for many Europeans, they think that they call it the New World because they discovered it, but it's not the New World because, as I told you guys, people were living here for thousands and thousands of years, right? So these Aboriginal peoples, Aboriginal groups lived harmoniously. They had an economic system in place that worked for them with use of natural resources to make goods for trade and the idea of living off the land. I think maybe in grade 8, you guys talked about this, the idea that they only used what was needed. They didn't go over, right? They're very collectivist. They were very thankful for everything that they had. They didn't just do things for the sake of doing it. So the system of self-government maintained happiness among the citizens. And by 1812, when we burnt the White House down, European settlers outnumbered Aboriginal peoples by a ratio of 10 to 1 in Eastern Canada. So they outnumbered European people by 10 to 1. A number of reasons why. Some of them was illness, war, basically just a whole bunch of government policies and colonial policies basically led to European people outnumbering our indigenous people, especially in Eastern Canada. Okay, so as I always said, feel free to pause if you need to go back to anything. Review if you missed something. Don't worry, I'll always be here. So self-government, their system of self-government obviously maintained that's basically the way that they govern themselves. And so self-government is referred to an inherent, and you guys will see the word inherent every once in a while. What does the word inherent mean? It means built in. A pre-existing right rooted in Aboriginal people's long occupation and government of the land, my bad, before European settlement. And so they said we were here first. We had our own governments. We should be allowed to continue these systems of government. The ideas of modern liberalism is government regulation and interference in the economy. So remember, this is very modern liberal, government regulation and interference in the economy. And so Aboriginal self-government challenges this by having a population operate under their own distinct identity within a country. And so basically, with modern liberalism, government plays a larger role, but Aboriginal self-government, Aboriginal thought challenges this because he says, government, you can do your own thing. We were already here first. We're going to run our own systems. And so this is a challenge to modern liberalism because it says that even if there's a government that's getting involved, we don't need that. We're going to do our own thing. So imagine we have like a class, which is we have rules, and then you have 1 or 2 people who are just doing their own thing. They become a challenge to the system that we have. And so that's why Aboriginal self-government is oftentimes considered a challenge to modern liberalism. And so we talk about conflicting ideologies. You'll notice that you have the same graphic in your notes. So relations between early Europeans and Aboriginal people were complicated because you will notice with the European worldview, right, Humans at the top, birds and animals are below, fish and reptiles, plants, flowers, and trees. There's a hierarchy, right? Animals are below us, and so on. With indigenous people, it's a circle. We are all together. We are all in this together. You are not better than me. And so this we considered very individualistic, very classically liberal, even the hierarchy, right? This was very collectivist. Let's go back. This could be considered very collectivist. And so you start to see that their worldviews will cause some conflict. Sounds good? So a good example of these differing perspectives is the question of land ownership. And so to the Aboriginals, a person does not own land. He or she is part of it, right? The great example I give is family. For many indigenous and Aboriginal people, land ownership doesn't make sense. I can't own it because I'm part of it. I can't own my family. I'm part of it. Right? So the land and people essentially belong to one another. You own the land as much as the land owns you. That's how it works for indigenous people, Aboriginal people. And for the settlers or the Europeans, it was very different. They viewed land as something that could be bought and sold. Right? They view land as something that could be bought and sold. So you're Aboriginal people, I can't buy it. I'm one with land. European settlers, I can buy it, I can sell it. So obviously this will create some problems. I hope your brain is starting to go and you guys can see some of the problems that we are going to face. And so the Europeans viewed Aboriginal peoples as primates or savages. Even Rousseau, who was being kind of nice, called them noble savages. And so, as I always said, feel free to pause. Feel free to pause, get the information, and then come back and listen. Right? Sometimes we're people. So treaties are often ignored because the Europeans viewed themselves as superior to the Aboriginals. So it says, there's no point keeping these treaties because we are better than you. So their land can be taken without bothering with treaties. This is called ethnocentrism and Eurocentrism. These two terms are crucial. They're so important, I put them in blue. And so you'll notice on your note packages, there's space for you to copy down what ethnocentrism and what Eurocentrism means. And so ethnocentrism is evaluating other cultures according to the standards and customs of one's own culture. Right? So anytime I judge other cultures as inferior to mine and I'm using my cultural standards to judge everyone else, that is ethnocentrism. Eurocentrism is just more specific. It's basically when we evaluate other cultures according to the standards and customs of European culture. So Eurocentrism is a type of ethnocentrism. Ethnocentrism is the big umbrella, and Eurocentrism is a type of ethnocentrism. You guys see that? Eurocentrism is a type of ethnocentrism. So many believe that it was their duty to assimilate the Aboriginal people into European religion. There's this incredibly troubling poem called The White Man's Burden, which basically talks about how many Europeans thought it was like their burden from God to assimilate Aboriginal people. That basically they were doing God a favor by assimilating Aboriginal peoples. Good? All right. So conflicting land holding ideologies. So by the time of Confederation in 1867, if you guys get any sources which talks about 1867 in Canada, 1867, your mind should click. That was Confederation, right? That's basically when we became a country. 123 treaties and land surrenders had already been negotiated with British North America, and by 1975 there were 500 treaties. And many contemporary conflicts between First Nations and Canadian government have resulted from some of these agreements, right? And so the weird thing about treaties is that treaties don't have an end date. So they keep going on and on and on and on and on. And so some of the issues that we had when the treaties were first signed keep going on because there is no end date to them. A great example of this is I had a professor at university. He was a member of a First Nations band in central Alberta. And because the treaties had promised basically hundreds of years ago that this group would get $5 every year, $5 if you adjust for inflation was a lot more back then, but the treaties are not adjusted for inflation. So even today, every year they go down back to the reserve and they get $5 from the government because these treaties never end. And so he said He would take some time every year, go down to the band, get his $5, go to Tim Hortons, buy a coffee and donut, and go back the next year. So when we talk about treaties, this is some of the differences between First Nations and the Government of Canada. And so for many First Nations people, treaties were agreements made with sovereign nations, upheld by oral tradition. The relationship with the land is collective, spiritual, land provided by the Creator, underlying collective, right? Because they're very collectivist, and people exist in harmony with the land, and treaties are established to share the land with the newcomers, underlying the word share. They believe that they were sharing the land, they were not selling land. And so for the Government of Canada, which was mostly European, people of European descent, treaties were agreements made by interested parties, upheld by a written document. And so for many Indigenous people, the words weren't so important. It was the spirit behind it. But for Europeans, words were everything. And so for Europeans of the government, you guys will hear me say the word European and government interchangeably. The reason I do that is because many of the people in early Canadian government were of European descent and had a very European worldview. So land is a resource that can be owned by individuals for their own use, and treaties were established to clear a way for European settlement, right? And so I hope you guys starting to see that for the Government of Canada, very collectivist. For the Government of Canada, very individualistic. For our Indigenous people, our First Nations people, very collectivist. And imagine two people signing the same treaty and one believing one thing, one believing the other. We'll see a lot of conflict because of this. Okay, so some of the reasons for conflict. We don't have to wait for long to find out. And so once again, feel free to pause, write down the stuff in red. That's the stuff that goes into your note packages. And then I'll keep talking. So I'll give you guys a couple of seconds to write that down, then I'll keep talking. Okay, let's go. So the British insisted on European-style written and signed treaties, as they did not trust oral agreements and traditions. So they did not trust oral agreements and traditions. First Nations groups were often not governed by a hierarchical leadership that commanded a population to follow the leader's decisions. A chief could sign for their immediate band, but not an entire population. So when the chief is signing the treaty, for many Indigenous people, he's only signing for a small group, not for the entire population. But for Europeans, they believed that it was for everyone. And so there was obviously a language barrier that required translators, and many of the translators were not very honest or did not totally understand the agreements themselves, right? So they would either be skewed or they would fail to understand certain things. And the language used to define land ownership had no equivalent in First Nations culture. Why is that? Because as I mentioned earlier, the idea of land ownership did not exist for many Indigenous groups or First Nations groups. So Eurocentrism or European superiority called the legal status of the treaties into question, despite their written documents. Europeans believed that the First Nations were not sovereign nations. What does the word sovereign mean? It means independent. And so Europeans believed that the First Nations were not independent. They were not independent, and so they were not independent nations, and so they basically did not consider the treaties valid. They felt free to break many of them. Okay, we good? Okay, and so resistance by Aboriginals to liberal values was not accepted by Canadian government. This led to policies of assimilation. In case you're wondering, we are now page 7. Now page 7. This led to policies of assimilation to impose adherence to liberal goals of Aboriginal. So anytime Aboriginal people resisted, these ideas were imposed on them so that they would follow through. So under these policies, Aboriginals were supposed to give up their distinct cultures and tradition, such as the potlatch. What's interesting is the way the potlatch ceremony works. It's really hard to do in a room by myself. The way the potlatch ceremony works is every single person in the community comes together, they bring things of value, and then we start sharing. So basically, I need something, I take it from you. I need something from Cade, I take it from Cade. Cade needs something from me, he takes it from me. I need something from Rachel, I need something from Amy, I need something from Noah. And we're basically trading, we're constantly sharing things. And so the Government of Canada outlawed this because if you are a liberal, if you're very individualistic, this idea of sharing your property does not register. It doesn't make sense. So the potlatch and other ceremonies were. Okay, so I'm just going to jump down and we're going to talk about assimilation. Assimilation. So when Canada first became a nation, the government tried to civilize Canada's Aboriginal people. I put in air quotes civilized because they thought of them as uncivilized. However, we talked about in Unit 2 that the idea of Western democracy borrows very heavily from Indigenous people. So they considered them uncivilized, felt they had to civilize them. In actuality, many of them were quite civilized, even more civilized than many European cultures. This was done by assimilating the Aboriginals into Canadian culture. In other, in other words, making them abandon their native religions and cultural practices and join mainstream society. Once again, I'm using the word native to talk about their original. We don't use the word native to describe people. If you guys ever say native people in your essays, boom, I'm going to use marks because that is derogatory. Like saying that blacks, that's derogatory. Essentially, the First Nations were treated as children in need of proper education and a firm hand, right? So they were treated as children in need of proper education and a firm hand. Paternalistic acts or wards of the state. You guys will see something somewhere in my test on essays on sources talks about wards of the state. A ward of the state is someone who is to be taken care of as a child. So basically, they were treated like kids who had to be taken care of by the state or the government. And the treatment of Aboriginal peoples was formalized in the Indian Act of 1876. Indian Act basically formalized how they're going to be treated like children or wards of the state. Okay, so attempts to assimilate. And so the great aim of our legislation has been to do away with the tribal system and assimilate the Indian people in all respects. Sir John A. Macdonald. John A. Macdonald. So John A. Macdonald in 1887, our first prime minister, he says the great aim of our legislation, basically the chief objective of government policy, is to do away with the tribal system and assimilate the Indian people in all respects. Right. So basically, the aim of government is to assimilate them. And so, what are some of the ways that they did this? Number one, through enfranchisement, methods. So we are on page number 8. Some of the methods that they used to assimilate were enfranchisement by voting. They gave up their Indianness, the Indian Act, and residential schools. These are some of the methods that they used to assimilate. So we're going to start off with enfranchisement. The first thing we're going to talk about is something called the Gradual Civilization Act that was signed in 1857. And so under the Gradual Civilization Act, status Indians, which were people who were by the government considered Indian or First Nations, and so the government is defining who a First Nation person is, are wards of the Canadian federal government, a paternalistic, this is when they treat you like a child, paternalistic, legal relationship that illustrates the historical imperial notion that Aboriginal people are children, requiring control and direction to bring them into more civilized colonial ways of life. Your status would have made you eligible for the benefits outlined in the treaty signed by your ancestors. So only people who had status could get all the different benefits that were outlined in the treaties. And if you were a status Indian or considered First Nations by the government, you were basically treated like a child. And so First Nations men who gave up their official Indian status were given, we are on page number 9, some of the things that they were given, 3 things, is they will receive 50 acres of land on the reserve for their personal use and become part of mainstream society. So they were given land. They receive a share of treaty settlements and band money. And following his death, family would inherit land. And so basically the government was giving all these things to encourage them to give up their Indian status, to give up their status as Aboriginal people. So enfranchisement, or the right to vote, or to be considered a member of the Canadian body, was basically used as a bargaining tool to make them give up their status. So method number 2, we are still on page number 9. Now we're on page number 9. The Indian Act. This is the second method they used to assimilate. And so it was put into effect in 1876. If you do the quick math, that is about 9 years after we became a country. Became a country in 1867. No, yes, 9 years. Okay, it was and still is a piece of social legislation for a very broad scope, which regulates and controls virtually every aspect of First Nations life. As always, feel free to pause at any point, get your info down, and then just feel free to play again. I'm not going to get math. And so the act was administered directly by Aboriginal committees by the Indian agent. So the Indian Act, was basically enforced by someone called the Indian agent, often called the white chiefs. Many of these people were not from these communities. They were basically government employees who made sure that Indigenous people or First Nations people were controlled. Their role was to displace traditional Aboriginal leaders in order to bring in a new way of living, which was in line with the government. So the original leaders were taken out, and these white chiefs were brought in to basically dictate what's going to happen. And under this system, First Nations were to be treated as children or wards of the state. Enfranchisement continued to be pushed. Marriage between, this is important, a First Nations person and a Caucasian would result in a loss of Indian status, especially for women. And those who wanted to attend university had to accept mandatory enfranchisement. So if you wanted to go to university, you would automatically lose your status. And these were all ways the Indian Act was basically used to control them. If you lived on the reserve and you had a car you wanted to sell, you need to get special permission from the government to sell your own car, because everything on the reserve was basically property of the Canadian government. Right? Okay, all good to go. This is always really weird, just talking, like in a room talking to myself, and yet talking to you at the same time. Weird. Okay, so the Indian Act. Indians could acquire full Canadian citizenship by relinquishing their ties to the community. So Indians, as I say in air quotes, we don't call Indigenous people that now because that is offensive. And so they could acquire full Canadian citizenship by doing these things: giving up their culture and traditions, giving up any rights to land, receiving a university degree, marrying a non-Aboriginal man, voting in a federal election, and joining the armed forces. These are ways you could acquire full citizenship. But then by acquiring full citizenship, by joining mainstream society, you were denied your Aboriginal status. The government of Canada saw the Indian Act as a temporary measure to control Aboriginal people until they were fully assimilated through enfranchisement. So enfranchisement was basically this idea that they had. They're going to assimilate every First Nations person, and until that was done, they would use the Indian Act. So we are now on page number 10, in case you're wondering. And so what was the result of the Indian Act and its plan on enfranchisement? The rate of enfranchisement was extremely low. Hardly anyone took up their offer. And in the 1960s, there was a policy change where Indians were granted the right to vote in federal elections. So up until the 1960s, that's crazy. So Indigenous people have been here forever, and up until the 1960s, they were granted the right to vote. Right? So remember, Canada becomes a country in 1867. That is crazy. That's almost 100 years later. Bad at math, but I'm good at dates. Right. So the Indian Act reforms, these are some of the changes that occur. I wrote this down for you. The Indian Act is still in place, but it has been changed and amended. So, someone asked me about what amendments have been made to our Constitution. The Indian Act is like any law is considered like a living document. It can change, and these are some of the changes. In 1884, it prohibited religious ceremonies. In 1951, the loss of Indian status for women who married non-status men. These are some of the changes that occurred. In 1969, the White Paper, which we're going to talk about, was pushed forward. In 1969, the Red Paper. In 1985, women could keep or regain their status even after marrying a non-status man, and children of such marriage were granted status. So what I want you guys to see is that the Indian Act is a living document, constantly changing. So we're going to talk about the White Paper. You guys will notice this young man, this old young man. This is Pierre Trudeau, Justin's dad, JT's dad. So in 1969, Pierre Trudeau's government brought in something called the White Paper. It wasn't called the White Paper. It was called, I think, the Government of Canada Policy on Indian Peoples, but it was nicknamed the White Paper. And so what did it want to do? He wanted to bring Aboriginal people into the pluralistic society. So basically, he wanted to remove what made them unique and bring them into just mainstream Canadian society. And so Pierre Trudeau wrote this article called The Just Society, where he talked about his vision for Canada. And he proposed to abolish treaties, abolish the Department of Indian Affairs, and basically abolish anything that kept Aboriginal people unique. Right? So it basically says we're going to abolish or remove anything that makes you special and bring you into mainstream society. And obviously, there was hostile reception because the First Nations people were not consulted. Right? They were pissed. Like, you can't just remove everything that makes us who we are. The treaties suck, but they still define us as a unique people, and you can't do that without talking to us. That's why I call it the White Paper, because it was the perspective of the white man. White Paper, good you know, white man. You guys see links. So as a result, there was the Red Paper. So the White Paper was passed, and the Red Paper, who do you think's perspective is that from? The Aboriginal people, right? And so Aboriginals responded with their own document called Citizen Plus in 1970, and this became commonly known as the Red Paper. So we had the White Paper and then the Red Paper, which countered all the proposals of the White Paper. And so an Aboriginal delegation, backed by other Canadian citizens, met with the government, and they basically said, we need to see changes, right? If you guys flip to page number 12, it talks about some of the objections they had. They were mad that no negotiation was took place, and they wanted negotiations to be required, and they wanted access to services and benefits in the treaties to be continued. So the Red Paper is the Indigenous or First Nation response to the White Paper. Okay. All right. So remember, Pierre Trudeau writes this article called A Just Society. And as a response, Cree leader Harold Cardinal writes something called The Unjust Society. Very creative. And so he basically criticized the government's response, and he says, the only good Indian is a non-Indian, or the only good Indian is a dead Indian, as morbid as it is. He thought that the government was trying to remove Indigenous people off the face of the Canadian map. And so he insisted he wanted to remain a red tile on the Canadian mosaic. He said, I am going to remain specifically and uniquely Indigenous. And so he wanted, obviously, changes in Aboriginal rights, education, social programs, and economic development. And as a result of this backlash, the Canadian government withdrew the White Paper. They said, nah, people ain't feeling this. It's too much backlash. The Aboriginal people want to maintain their distinct status. Said, we're going to stop that. Okay, flip to page number 15. We're almost done, guys. All right. So the Canadian government formed the Royal Commission on Aboriginal People in 1991 to examine government policy with respect to the original historical nations of this country. And so the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples was basically, they wanted to study how we relate to Indigenous peoples. Royal Commission, the reason it's called a Royal Commission is our head of state is the king or queen. Probably in a few years, it's going to be a king. So after 5 years of inquiries and public hearings, the commission announced a number of recommendations. Some of the recommendations, those three big ones: the creation of legislation recognizing the sovereignty or right to self-determination. If you don't know what sovereignty means, you can just write underneath, right of self-determination of Aboriginal peoples. The creation of institutions of Aboriginal self-government, and the creation of initiatives to address social, education, health, and housing needs. And so these initiatives were created to address social, education, health, and housing needs. So obviously, basically they said that we've been treating Aboriginal people like second-class citizens, and the whole point of this commission, they realized that, you know what, we need to give them the right to determine their future. We need to take care of them socially in terms of education, in terms of health-wise, and housing. Right? We are still on page 13. So Since 1996, many people have been critical of what they see as a lack of government action, right, to address some of the recommendations. The Commission came up with these recommendations, and one of the things you'll notice about the history of Canada is that we say a lot of things, we don't always back them up. This was actually one of the things on the diploma last year, talking about how the government has made a lot of promises, but they don't always back them up. And in fact, they actually just keep imposing the ideas on Indigenous people. And so obviously one positive result of the Commission's recommendation was the creation of the Aboriginal Healing Foundation. Right, we're on page number 13. I think we're on, it's like a little bit past half on the page. So one positive result of the Commission was the creation of the Aboriginal Healing Foundation. And its mission is to encourage and support Aboriginals in their recovery from physical and sexual abuse that many suffered in the residential school system. As you guys may know from grade 10, a lot of Indigenous people, First Nations people, suffered horrible abuse in the residential school system. And so to accomplish this, they pledged more than $400 million to various programs across Canada that would help with counseling and so on. And so the last method number 3 for how the government sought to assimilate Indigenous people is residential schools. Method number 1 was enfranchisement. Method number 2 was the Indian Act. Method number 3 was residential schools. And so obviously one of the major methods of assimilation was the residential school system. So we are now on page number 14. Under the system, Aboriginals were to be educated in European culture, science, history, language, and religion, with Aboriginal culture being phased out. And so they were taught European ways of doing things. Aboriginal culture was phased out. You guys notice in the pictures, the kids are all praying, right? Obviously Christian prayers. I think they are either just getting their hair cut by a nun, and the kids are, I think this is from an old propaganda video where the kids are reciting some lessons in English. And so they're obviously taught stuff from the European perspective, no Aboriginal stuff is allowed. And so some of the conditions in the schools. So Aboriginal students were, as always, stuff in red, stuff that you guys copy down. Aboriginal students were forced to attend. Right? Many of them were taken from their homes. They were often moved from their families and housed in walled residences, where in many cases parents didn't know where their kids were being taken. If they spoke their native language, once again, native is here talking about their original, or practiced their own beliefs, they were often beaten. They were not allowed to miss class, even if they were severely ill, and this contributed to the spread of diseases such as tuberculosis among the students. In severe cases, students were subjected to sexual abuse. I saw this really weird thing that you had a better chance of surviving World War II as a soldier, as a Canadian soldier, than you did surviving the residential schools. That's crazy. Honestly, guys, I think the residential school is, I think, probably one of the darkest points in Canadian history. It's something that I think we have to, as a country, we also have to remember these stories, and we have to pledge, just like it was like the Holocaust. It was basically a Canadian Holocaust, like cultural genocide. So some of the legacies of residential schools. These experiences disrupted and damaged the students, their families, and communities. Many Indigenous people, like I know a couple of friends who their family members went to residential schools and they never talk about it because of so much trauma. Many people turn to alcohol and drugs to numb the pain. Many of them, because they were taken away from their families, they didn't know how to love. They didn't experience love from their parents. When they had children, all they ever knew was anger and hate, and they have a hard time expressing love to their own kids. And so in 1998, the government acknowledged the excesses of the residential school system and began the process of reconciliation and restitution with those who have been forced to attend. This date's important because the last residential school was closed in 1996. 1996, you might want to make a note of that. And in 2008, in an address that was broadcast nationally, Prime Minister Stephen Harper formally apologized for the creation of the residential school system. Last year on the diploma, there was a picture of like a bus on blocks. It says the Conservative Party's plans of reconciliation. And it was like two speakers basically saying that they've apologized, but in actuality, many Indigenous people can still continue to face incredible segregation and racism within Canada. I've seen it at a lot of Indigenous friends who continue to face a lot of racism and segregation in Canada. And so, obviously, the same year, the Conservative government, started the Truth and Reconciliation Commission that set aside $10,000. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission is important because that was one of the diploma topics last year. It's basically this program which basically studied how can we reconcile Canada after the residential schools, and it set aside $10,000 for survivors and their families. In 2017, the Liberal government of Justin Trudeau offered a second apology to survivors in Newfoundland and Labrador. My question is it enough? Is giving money enough? Is offering apologies enough? Is there more that can be done after we try to impose liberalism on these people? So to end off, I'm going to show you guys two quick videos. One is the apology by the government. And the last second is Connie Wenjack, which is a story of an Indigenous child. Government of Canada apology. Residential schools. Canada apology for residential schools. Here, I'll give it a show. This is
to former students of Indian residential schools. The treatment of children in Indian residential schools is a sad chapter in our history. Two primary objectives of the residential school system were to remove and isolate children from the influence of their home, families, traditions, and cultures, and to assimilate them into the dominant culture. These objectives were based on the assumption that Aboriginal cultures and spiritual beliefs were inferior and unequal. Indeed, some sought, as was infamously said, to kill the Indian in the child. Today, we recognize that this policy of assimilation was wrong, has caused great harm, and has no place in our country. The Government of Canada built an educational system in which very young children were often forcibly removed from their homes, often taken far from their communities. Many were inadequately fed, clothed, and housed. All were deprived of the care and nurturing of their parents, grandparents, and communities. First Nations, Inuit, and Métis languages and cultural practices were prohibited in these schools. Tragically, some of these children died while attending residential schools, and others never returned home. The government now recognizes that the consequences of the Indian residential schools policy were profoundly negative.
So I'm going to show you guys this quick video. It's a Heritage Minute, and so this is the story of Connie Wenjack. He was a child who ran away from a residential school in 1966, and he passed away while trying to run away.
Johnny wanted to go back home. It was 1,000 kilometers away. They forced him to go to the Indian residential school. More than 150,000 of us children had to go. They wanted to change us.
Our Father in heaven, hallowed be your name.
Hallowed be your name.
Thy kingdom come.
Thy kingdom come.
Thy will be done.
Thy will be done.
Kill the Indian and the child. It's been called cultural genocide. I survived residential school. My brother Johnny did not.
Connie Wenjack was one of thousands of children who died due to Canada's residential school system. More than 80,000 survivors and their families still live with its legacy today.
All right. And so that is basically today's lesson on the imposition of liberalism. Yeah, and so we're going to talk about, that's first part two. Part one, part two is on how we impose liberalism in other countries. All right, guys. At this point, if you are done and you've copied out everything, if you missed something, go back. If you're not sure about something, feel free to ask this version of Mr. And when you are done, come talk to me and I'll have a knowledge check to make sure that you understand everything that you listened to and you copied down so that you're ready for tomorrow. All right, guys. Peace.